Hey, thank you for joining me for part 2 on bumblebee foraging. In this second episode, we're going to be looking at the collection and provisioning by workers of pollen and nectar. Let's get into it. So obviously we're foraging for nectar and pollen, the nectar for energy, the pollen for all those good things like proteins and vitamins. But when we're talking about foraging, there are a bunch of considerations by researchers. First of all, what's the landscape like and what are the available resources? Is there a division of labor? We know there is some division of labor, and then I have a couple of questions. And then let's look at the considerations for foraging. What time of day, what's the quality of the product, and then the energy and foraging distances. We will look at those considerations in part 3. So landscape, what's the elevation, what's the terrain like, what's the vegetation type? Those are all going to be important as they affect access and the weather. Next is, what are the available resources? So what plant species are available for that bumblebee species? What's the timing or the plant phenology? When does it flower? What's the density of those flowers? And what's the quality of the resources, the pollen and nectar from them? And then obviously, how far is it from the nest? How far do they have to travel? So there is a division of labor. Some of the workers will stay in the colony caring for the queen and the brood. So there are those that go out to forage for nectar and pollen, and they bring that back in, and the workers that are in the colony will be feeding the queen with that nectar and feeding the young the pollen and helping out with the care of the queen and the colony itself. But my question is there a division of labor when it comes to collecting pollen and nectar? Because I've heard and read, some bees will collect nectar only, some will collect pollen only, so what is it? Well, I came across this article when I was doing a literature review with 2014 Bombus terrestris study. This is the buff-tailed bumblebee in Europe, probably the most studied bumblebee there is, and there were some interesting findings. And what they found is that only 15% just went after nectar. Now, in this study, it was an artificial setting where they did different concentrations of sugar solution. So think of that as the nectar. And in this study, only 15% actually went after the nectar or the sugar substitute, sugar solution. 85% collected both the nectar and the pollen, or the nectar substitute and the pollen. Further from the study, they found some other interesting things. They had created sugar solutions that had different concentrations. Now, in the wild, this could be very different, but in the wild, Goulson says that there's probably 40 to 60% sugars in nectar, okay? And in this study, they found that, which was assumed, that bumblebees could definitely distinguish that concentration, that they could find and tell that this was a better resource of nectar than the other. However, when it came to pollen, where the researchers provided pollen and pollen substitutes, which were not pollen, they couldn't distinguish between that while they were collecting. Now, maybe when they got back into the colony and were able to taste it, perhaps. But anyway, they could not distinguish. So really interesting finding. Now, when it comes to nectar collection, please check out Dr. Strange's Bumblebee Biology talk on YouTube. He says that nectar is usually collected in the morning because the plant resource will become depleted as the day goes on, as it's fed on. And so they'll collect in the morning. That allows the plant by the next day to replenish that nectar. Some plants can do that. Then in an interesting study that's part of his research with his graduate students, they were looking at nectar and pollen collection trips and the timing of that. And he found that on average, nectar collection took about 15 minutes. So they would mark a bee leaving the colony or the nest, and when it came back, and those that came back with just nectar, it took about 15 minutes, and very quickly they could unload that nectar and then go back out. Goulson points out that bumblebees can probably carry half their weight in nectar, so they can do pretty well with that. So anyway, if you want to see more detail, because some of these nectar trips were very quick, check out Dr. Strange's talk, because he has graphics on a lot of this. And this study was done with, most of his work is done with Bombus huntii. Now when it comes to pollen collection, Dr. Goulson in his textbook points out that some flowers are very complex to collect pollen, and you may require a bumblebee that has more experience. So perhaps the older workers will be the ones collecting the pollen. But he points out also that pollen will not be collected when it's wet, when there's dew, when there's a high relative humidity. So a lot of it may be collected midday or later. Going back to Dr. Strange's research on when it comes to pollen collection in that study with his graduate students on Bombus huntii, the average trip for pollen collection was twice that of nectar. The average was 30 minutes, and it took more than 5 minutes to unload the pollen load. So with that, I refer you to the Goulson Bumblebee textbook by Oxford University Press. This article from Cosman and Luna that you can read and search on Google and find it online, and then Dr. Strange's biology lecture, Bumblebee biology lecture on YouTube. So I refer you to those for more detail. And thank you for joining me. In the next talk, we'll get into looking at energy usage and foraging distances in part 3. Thank you. Hope you'll join me in about 2 weeks for that talk. See you.